Our reading today is from Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 23. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel, this is the gospel that you heard, and that it has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. The word of the Lord.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks. Well, good morning. Good to be together. It is Palm Sunday, also for me known as the day where at least one or two children whip me with one of the palms in the hallway. It's fine. Sometimes, usually it's my daughter at a minimum, but there we go. Welcome. A long time ago, many years ago, some of my relatives showed up in New York Harbor. And what they would have seen there, the first thing they would have seen would have been Lady Liberty on aptly named Liberty Island, foreshadowing what they hoped they were coming into, which was a place marked by the promise of liberty. Now, when I think about that concept of liberty today, and I even just call to mind maybe some of the phrases and some of the slogans that have liberty in it in our culture: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty and justice for all. Give me liberty or give me death. Or liberty, liberty, liberty. Okay, so less iconic, also meaningful though from the insurance commercial. We love liberty. We love freedom. It's arguably the most revered value in our society today. But what do we really mean by freedom? Now writers have written about two understandings of freedom: negative as opposed to positive freedom. The first is negative, which really means this, that it's typically the vision of freedom that we have in the modern West, and that is the permission to do whatever we want. So that is negative freedom. The Notre Dame professor, Patrick Deneen, pointed out this idea, though. It didn't start in the 1960s and with Woodstock, this conception of freedom, but actually way before that, in the 1760s with the Enlightenment and with the founding fathers, whose goal was to create a new society based on this, in a sense, negative definition of freedom, where freedom was seen as the ability to do whatever you want. But then there is positive freedom, which is the freedom that Jesus and Paul and the early Christians proposed, where freedom wasn't about having no restraint and casting off restraint, but it was about embracing the proper restraint that would give you the power to want and to do good. And we think about, maybe, I've heard it put this way, think about a fish that is in a goldfish bowl. It might say to itself, I'm tired of the shackles and the oppression of this bowl. I want to get out of the bowl so I can be free. And so, but if you take it out of what appears to be a lack of freedom and you put it on the table, the fish is flopping around on the table, it is no longer thriving, that the bowl was actually better. That vision of freedom was actually better than the perceived freedom of being outside of the bowl. Christianity doesn't propose a kind of freedom where I'm simply led by my own impulses and my own desires and drives. Human beings, as opposed to other creatures that are out there, have the ability to actually override our desires when they're unhelpful or when they're off base. I mean, think about this. Think about a lion. A hungry lion doesn't look at an antelope and say, is this the right decision? You know, the lion isn't watching a Netflix documentary about veganism and like, I have to reconsider my choices. I feel convicted about that. It does what it does. It's a lion. Good luck to the antelope. See, culture, though, is saying something like that to us today, saying, you're actually like that lion. You can't help it. Go for the tasty antelope. You do you. And yet the Bible sees this as rather problematic and potentially even dangerous way to live and certainly to operate as a society. Now, if we were to pick a physical, just one simple physical item to sort of represent where we might be in culture today, I would probably pick a compass with a broken needle, where there's really no sense of direction. And if you've ever done any longer range hiking or kind of an adventure, an outdoor adventure like that, if you're on a journey and your compass breaks, it's just a matter of time until you're gonna be lost. We're living in a time when autonomy and freedom, full autonomy and full freedom, again, one definition of freedom, is seen as what it is to be a healthy person. It's what it is to be even a healthy culture. And freedom, of course, we affirm freedom. It's a wonderful and biblical concept, but unchecked, freedom and autonomy can also end up becoming a form of tyranny in our lives. And here's what, if the spinning, broken compass, if it had a voice, here's what it would say. Do what feels good, do what feels right, with a caveat, right? We're reasonable, so long as it doesn't harm anybody else. And it sounds kind of intuitive, it sounds right. Do what feels right to you, do what feels good, so long as it doesn't harm anybody else. But here's the problem. Nobody agrees on what constitutes harm, and nobody agrees on what constitutes good. We're seeing this all the time. Okay, just a few examples. Last Sunday night, there was an event at the Oscars that happened, apparently. I'm not gonna go there. We're not gonna get into that. But even reacting to that moment at the Oscars, there are a range of perspectives on what was good and what was harm, what could have happened, what should have happened. There are many different perspectives on that one cultural moment. Or take political ideology, political tribes, seeing the other as ruining the country. Or even just a real world scenario, current culture wars about legislation matters in Florida today. Both sides are arguing for good and against harm, and yet are diametrically opposed to one another. See, a spinning moral compass leads to confusion and chaos in our lives. How well is freedom really going for us? What's the fruit? Are we feeling more liberated and carefree, or are we actually getting more and more dissatisfied with our lives? Addiction is rampant. Relationships are breaking down. There's hopelessness and division that are overwhelming to many of us. Welcome to church, by the way. I want to just encourage us today a little bit. See, we have more options than ever as human beings, and yet we might be more miserable than ever too. Because we don't have a shared definition of reality. There's no agreed upon set of beliefs. There's no transcendent set of guidelines or external authority. All that I have is myself. The great writer David Foster Wallace observed as he looked at many of his liberated, educated peers. And Wallace was not, as far as we know, a person of faith, but he observed his peers and as they were aging together, and he said this as he looked around, this is a generation that has an inheritance of absolutely nothing as far as meaningful moral values. Postmodern ethics make life very confusing. It makes life chaotic. It makes society tense and angry and divided. We need the compass to stop spinning. This is part of why we've been in this series through this time of Lent called Steadfast, meeting our need for firm foundation. And we've been looking at different facets, and no, you're not crazy if you're like, didn't we read that passage last time? Yes, we've been reading every exact passage every single week in Lent and looking at different angles and different verses of that text as we've been going. And there's been some challenging messages, right? There's some challenging content in this passage. It's really a reality check for us to examine our own foundation. And here in Colossians, Paul is writing to a group of Christian believers in Colossae, or modern day Turkey. And he's writing to them because there were confusing things happening in their own cultural environment as well, right? There were, the needle of the compass was spinning, we might say. Their faith foundation was at risk. And today we want to do is look at two verses in particular that I think really speak to our moment in culture and also can help us guide our lives, how we're governing our lives as well. And here are the verses. It says, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Now, there's a concept out there called a life verse, right? Maybe you have a life verse where there's a verse that is just so meaningful to me. I put that in front of me and it's printed on something in my home. I've yet to meet somebody who had this verse 21 as their life verse. Yet to meet somebody who's like, yes, my evil behavior. That's my life verse. Because listen to what this is saying. It's saying that left to our own devices, our default posture is to be alienated from God. That means separated, estranged, distant, removed, that we function in such a way that God and his ways are actually our enemy. Again, thinking about the spinning compass, at a deeper level though, what is actually behind that? What is behind that sense of being untethered as a society? The problem is, I believe that we turn inwards toward ourselves to figure out our own definitions for good and for harm, that we look to ourselves for guidance and for direction. We're setting our own rules and setting our own course. And in the language of the Bible, it's the concept of sin. It's missing the mark of God's best intentions for us. One of the images that's used in Scripture, if you look at the word for sin, is actually the idea of an archer going for a target and missing the target. That's what happens with this idea of sin. We're actually missing God's best for us. Now again, though, regardless of your faith background, we probably know that there's a problem. We feel it, but we probably don't all agree on what the problem is, because we lack a consistent framework and a language for processing what's broken. For one group of people, the problem in our world is all external. It's out there. It's societal injustices. It is wrong government policies. It's flawed leaders in our government. It's a lack of education. It is inequity. It is disregard for the environment. And for others, the problem is not external, it's all internal, right? It's a problem of character. It's a problem that we just, as a people, we lack certain virtues. And if people just behaved better and lived more morally upright lives and believed the right guiding principles, then our world would be well. It would be almost a utopia if we could just do that. See, we are drawn to every possible explanation for the problems in our lives and the problems in our world, except for the reason that's woven throughout Scripture. Sin may seem like it seems like a very old-fashioned word, like an antiquated concept. I mean, are we talking about that in 2022? But yet we can't escape its presence. Biblically, sin is at least two things. It's both a state, a force in a way that affects everything, and it's an act. That is, there can be both a corporate or a system-wide understanding of sin, but also an individual conception of sin. That it's a force, but it can also be expressed in actions. But many times we don't think of it that way. We want to imagine the best about human nature, and especially about our own human nature. Tish Harrison Warren wrote recently an editorial in the New York Times about the concept of sin. And she said, "It can seem gentler and kinder to think of human beings as basically good, our intuitions basically correct, and our motives basically pure. But then we run into the hard facts of greed, genocide, abuse, oppression, lies, tyranny, hatred, jealousy, violence, murder, enslavement, and even mundane selfishness, impatience, arrogance, or resentment in our own heart." She goes on to say that the Christian understanding of sin is actually a very helpful and even a very hopeful thing. But there are unhelpful ways that we can sometimes in the church deal with and look at sin. And that is, we can tend to, oftentimes, again, this is a great overgeneralization, but we tend to, in church, either moralize sin or psychologize sin. And here's what we mean. There's the moralizing approach to sin. And this one tends to be, painting in broad strokes here, tends to be more common among more conservative Christian groups, where here sin is all about your bad behavior. The solution to sin is stop it. Get your act together, stop doing this particular list of bad things. Sin is all about rule breaking, right? And it's sort of defined narrowly like that. Just cut it out, just stop it. Then, on the other side, there is this tendency to psychologize sin, which again tends to be more prevalent among more progressive or liberal religious groups, which very differently than moralism focuses on our feelings instead of our behaviors. And here's what it says. You feel bad and you're acting badly because your needs aren't being met. Your family growing up didn't meet your needs. You have self-esteem and self-worth issues today. So my problem isn't sin. My problem is, it's not even a problem. It's my personality type. It's my wiring. It's how I am. It's not that I need forgiveness. I just need more self-awareness. I need more self-love and more education. Now, again, there's very good intentions and very good heart behind this, but often what we end up doing is it's an approach that tries to soothe us and bypasses getting to the root of what's actually under the surface in our lives. It's sort of trying to microwave a solution. Now, to be clear on both of these approaches, of course, it's not bad to address behavior in our lives, right? There's self-control is a biblical concept. And it's also not bad to have self-awareness, right? The work of therapy, we believe that therapy can be a gift from God. My own sister is a therapist. We believe in that. We care about that, and we support that as a church. But the gospel approach is that sin isn't just wrong acting or wrong feeling. It's that we've actually been looking to something other than Jesus to satisfy us. And so it's different than either moralizing or psychologizing. You know, I remember talking to a friend who was sick and was just feeling these weird symptoms in his body, and he was looking for help. He kept going to doctor after doctor and to appointment after appointment, and nobody had answers for him, scans and blood tests. And so what happened naturally to my friend is that as he was looking around for an answer, what happened to him? He became more despondent, more confused, more hopeless. Like, where in the world do I go for help then? Nobody seems to have any answers. And in a similar way, the proverbial doctors of our world want to point to a lot of things that are actually unhelpful and are very different, anything but what the Bible defines as sin. And yet, without a robust theology of sin, without a diagnosis of the problem, as awkward as it may be and uncomfortable as it may be as a topic culturally, or even in our hearts right now, without a theology of sin, we're actually left floundering and hopeless. With a minimized view of sin, well, first of all, at an individual level, I don't have any real hope of relief for my problems. I'm just left to be. That's how it is. It's sort of like a fatalism. Our issues are our issues. They are what they are. I don't really have a way to be reconciled with someone I've hurt or someone who's hurt me. At a societal level, it leaves us with sort of a tribalism, prone to conflict, or frankly, if left unchecked, maybe even anarchy. I mean, how many people right now are saying about the war in Ukraine, you know what? Putin is just being his authentic self. You know, let's let him, that's it, Putin's being Putin, let's let him do his thing. I don't want to be a judgmental person. Like, I'm a loving person, and just, no, who's actually saying that? But that's where potentially a secular understanding of a post-sin world actually leads. We have no basis for claims around justice, other than that's your opinion, and I have a different opinion than you. We have no kind of moral compass. I've been really enjoying some of her work recently. I appreciate what Jackie Hill Perry said about this topic. She said, in an attempt to justify their belief that God isn't antagonistic towards sin, there are those that will say, God is love. They most likely don't realize it, but what they're ultimately claiming is that God is unjust. Now, we'll come back to that in a second. And by the way, what we usually mean by God is love is God's got love for me. He's got love for me, which is defined as unquestioning affirmation and acceptance of me. But he's definitely got a problem with somebody else. I mean, did you hear what they did? To be clear, God is, what Jackie's saying, God is actually the God of love, but he's also the God of justice. God cares about sin. Why? It's not just arbitrary. God cares about sin because God cares about people, and sin destroys people. If God didn't care about sin, if he was like, you know what, it is 2022, we need to get over this. Let's get with the times. I'm going to lead the way. If that was what he was saying, you know what? Then if he didn't care about sin, he couldn't possibly care about the horrible things that happen to people. He couldn't possibly care about the pain in your life or injustices that happen in our society. Because when you love somebody, you get angry if something is hurting that person. It's not love to be like, they'll be fine. It's not love to say, I'll look the other way. The only way to make sense of our world is to have a robust view of the pervasive and universal nature of sin. To be alienated from God, which the text is talking about, is actually to be alienated from a sense of true north. Paul knows this. It was true for the Colossians, and it's true in Connecticut. But the good news of the gospel is that there actually is a remedy for the chaos. There's an exit ramp off the highway of madness, right? We don't have to live this way anymore. Christianity offers clarity in a time of confusion. And rather than being oppressive and restrictive in a negative sense, Christianity offers us a positive vision of freedom that actually liberates us. There is a remedy. There's a solution, and we can say this because of verse 22, where it says, but now he has reconciled you. But now. Once you were alienated, but now. Once you were held captive by the power of sin in your life, but now. Once you were walking in crippling shame and anxiety, but now. Once you thought you were alone. You thought nobody cared. But now. See, the incredible invitation of the gospel that we're looking at today is that if we're willing to be honest, if we're willing to deal with reality and not be the sort of a spiritual version of an ostrich with our head in the sand, that the gospel not only gives us a framework and a basis to process the brokenness in our world, but also offers us real hope and forgiveness and freedom. The cross invites us away from alienation and into relationship and reconciliation with God. Now, to think about the cross here as we enter into Holy Week and up toward Easter, the cross was a vile thing. It was reserved for the worst of criminals. To speak of crucifixion, it was considered so heinous that it was considered improper to even speak about crucifixion among polite company. And yet, Jesus voluntarily died for us, and it was with great purpose to reconcile us to God. The compass is broken, but here's how you get it back. That's what Jesus is doing here. And this reconciliation happens through his death. It says this, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death. We live in a time where we don't want to speak about sin and its consequences. We talk about mistakes, weaknesses, bad habits, poor choices. But we forget that actually at the core it comes from a rebellion against God and what he has for us. I appreciate this question. It's a hard-hitting question from Fleming Rutledge, who said, just as we think about the cross, what sort of predicament are we in that we should require the crucifixion of the Son of God? Very often we minimize what sin actually is, but sin has a chokehold on us. It's suffocating us. It's robbing us of life and of joy. And we can't escape it just through saying, well, stop doing it. That doesn't work. Have you tried that before? We can't escape it just through our human strategies or through our resolve or through just pretending it's not there. It is by the grace of Jesus. And look at the specificity of how Jesus saves us. It says through physical death on a cross. In other words, it's not just a generic death. There's a cost. There's a sacrifice. Jesus' death is not, as some have proposed, merely an example of love, right? Why did Jesus die? It was an example of love. Isn't it more than that, though? Maybe think about it this way. I want you to imagine that a family's house is on fire. And the house is blazing on fire. Thankfully, though, every person in the family gets out and is out on the sidewalk. Everybody's out. The dog is out. The hamster is out. They've rescued everybody, and they're on the sidewalk, and they're looking now at this inferno in this house. All their possessions are burning. They're like, man, that's our house. We've lived there for years. But everybody's on the sidewalk. And then a friend, a neighbor who's been a longtime friend, runs over to them and sees the burning house and looks at them and looks back at the house and then says, I love you, and then runs into the house, into the flames and dies. You wouldn't say, wow, what love. What an example of love. You'd say, what foolishness. You'd say, what tragedy. But now, let's think again about that scenario. Imagine a different story that the family's house is burning, that same house, and almost everybody is out of the house except for one young child who's still in the house. And that friend shows up and sees the child yelling out of the window as the flames and the smoke approaches that child. And the friend runs into the house, rescues the child, brings the child out, out onto the grass and says, I love you, and then collapses and breathes his last. That is love. That is sacrifice. That is rescue. Jesus didn't just die to be a role model of love. His death is actually doing something. It's rescuing us. It's repairing the alienation and the divide between the perfect love and goodness and flourishing that's in God and my rebellion Am I hard-heartedness? Am I stubbornness? Am I inconsistency? Am I selfishness? Jesus takes all of our sin, of our brokenness, our shame, what you've done, what's been done to you, the destructive patterns in our lives, all of those things that separate us from God's perfect holiness, and he offers lavish forgiveness to anyone from any background and any walk of life who is willing to come to him and accept him. Jesus took the consequence of sin and death that we deserve so that we can be, as the text says, without blemish and free from accusation. Jesus has so much for you. He wants to be with you. He wants to rescue you. He wants to give you clarity and hope. But this isn't just going to happen by me doing my own thing, by looking inward. Rather, something different. I love how Glenn Packiam put it. He said, the Lord's table, as we're going to come to the table in a moment, the Lord's table is not a potluck. I love a good potluck, by the way, good church potluck, but it brings me back. The Lord's table is not a potluck. We don't bring a side of good works and a side of shame. We come with empty hands and Christ fills them with his life. Jesus wants to be our true north, but he asks for our full trust and our full surrender. Today, as Scott mentioned, today is also Palm Sunday. It's the start of what we know as what we call Holy Week, where we have palms as a reminder of what happened many years ago when Jesus rode into Jerusalem, and the crowds were greeting him with palms. They lay palms on the road in front of him as a sign of honor, as a sign of respect, as a sign of welcome. They were welcoming him because they expected something from him, that he was going to fulfill their agenda, which specifically for them was that he was going to, in a military fashion, overthrow the occupying Roman forces. And he was going to jump on the throne himself as their new king. That's what they thought he was going to do. But Jesus knew that he had a different kind of mission: to reconcile us to God. A few days later, before he's arrested, there's another scene that happens where it says that during supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper, and he laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he tied it around his waist. And then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. This scene of the foot washing, if you've been around church for any length of time, it's easy to get desensitized to this, about what's happening here, where Jesus, who is a great leader and really a great king, Lord, takes the most lowly, humiliating position in the room. He takes on the position of a servant, and he washes dirty feet from every single one of his disciples, including the disciple who is going to betray him, who's going to sell him over to be tortured and killed for, in modern currency, about $200. And even as I was thinking about this week, about Jesus washing the feet of Judas, on one hand, you're like, man, what a nice thing, what a beautiful thing. But if I'm being real, if I'm being honest, I don't actually like it. Jesus, that's Judas. He's about to betray you. You're going to be tortured. You're going to be killed. Why would you do that for him? But that's the thing about grace. Grace it's a nice Christian word, but it's not usually cute and cuddly in real life. Grace is scandalous and it's offensive at times. You see, I think if we've been around church for a while, here's what can end up happening to us. We can end up having an entitlement mentality about grace for ourselves and a stinginess about grace for other people. The point isn't, wow, Jesus, like why would you do that for Judas? It's Jesus, that's amazing that you would do that for me. When I understand my sin and I understand grace, it actually helps me to humanize other people. Helps me to be more loving to other people. Now, Judas, in the end, did not accept and receive Jesus. He didn't open the gift that he was being given, but we do have a chance to say yes. that no matter how far we've gone, no matter what struggle we're walking with today, that the grace of God is always available to us. He's always ready to welcome us home. But do we know his heart for us? Do we know his heart? I recently saw a series of pictures. I'm just going to show a few of them now. There's a bunch of them. I just picked a few, like representative images. These powerful, this digital art online inspired by the scene of Jesus washing the disciples' feet, inspired an Australian artist named Jessica Bond. And it's this deliberately, and every single time Jesus is in the same position, it's this deliberately provocative series that's modeled on Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And it shows images of different kinds of people, different worldviews. It also has specific people too. It has particular world leaders, celebrities, public figures. And for some of these people, we might smile when we see Jesus washing their feet. And then there might be others where we're like, man, that one feels weird to me when I see that one. Some of us might even be upset, but I think that's the point. My response reveals something about my heart. And as the series has been released, and again, this is just a few pictures, there's a lot of other ones with other even notable figures in them. There have been some that have been hard to wrestle with. But as I think about this more, it's really, we're the one in the chair. We are the one in the chair. He came for us. In Christianity, there are ultimately two choices. I can deny Jesus and follow myself, or I can deny myself and follow Jesus. If I deny Jesus and follow myself, that's exactly what happened in those days after Palm Sunday. It's what many did, where I take my own place on the throne, where I'm in charge, and when that happens, then all the pressure to maintain my life is now on me. Or I can deny myself and follow Jesus. That is, I can submit my life, surrender my life to Jesus and to his ways, and I can actually fall into his arms and into his mercy and into his forgiveness. One path leads to confusion, the other path leads to clarity. The compass does have a true north, and it is life-giving, and it's healing, and it brings stability, and it brings wholeness. Are you tired today? Are you confused? Are you weary? Are you overwhelmed? Don't keep looking inward. Look to Jesus. The freedom that he's offering us today is true freedom. It is true liberty. It's better than the freedom that culture is offering us. And for some of us, I invite the band, the team to come up at this time. For some of us, I think this is a word that we need to hear today, that you're not too far gone for the grace of God in your life. There's nowhere you can go where his grace will not reach you. He's coming for you. He loves you. There's nowhere that you can't go too far. You can't get out of range. The grace of God is going to reach you. There's your family member, your spouse, your parent, your child. Not one of them are too far from the grace of God and the ability of God to reach them. Yes, there is a choice to be made, but God is ready and he's patient and he's waiting and he loves you. Because of Jesus, we can stand blameless before God, actually free, truly free, light, and at ease in his presence. Amen? We're going to move to a time of response. And it's going to be a little bit different today. We're going to bring ourselves before the cross to bring a prayer. Prayer could be a prayer of surrender. It could be a prayer of gratitude. Maybe there's, as we come to his throne of grace, maybe there's an area of sin in our lives. Maybe there's an area of falsehood where there's been, we have a different version of true north on our compass that we've been pursuing. And just this awareness that he has something not just different for me, but actually better for me, more life-giving for me. And so we're gonna have a few moments. You'll see there's cards around the chairs. I'd invite you to grab some of those cards and some of the pens too. And And there's two sides to this. The first side is for a prayer. We want to give you just a few moments right now, and the band's going to be playing under us, an opportunity to thank Jesus for who he is, for what he's done. And I want to invite everybody to do this. No one's going to be reading these prayers, but express yourself to Jesus. Maybe it's a place of celebration, a place of conviction, a place of repentance, a place of just acknowledging who he is. And if you're here today and you're like, I'm not really sure I'm not sure I'm ready to do that. I don't know what I think about Jesus. I don't know what I think about church. I would invite you to express that on here. Say, I'm not even sure. Just express your heart about what you're feeling right now before Jesus. And then out of that gratitude is the place where, this is the day in the year where we also as a church family bring on the other side of that card, our pledges too that we've been talking about and praying through for the last several weeks. And if you're new to Trinity or you're checking this out, you're not sure this is your church home, there's zero pressure. Either way, there's zero pressure to do this. We just love for you to bring your prayer forward. If you did already submit your pledge online, please don't feel like you need to repeat it on this card. We believe this moment is part of our worship. It's primarily between you and God. It is completely confidential. It's not a contract. There's likely one, if you're with a family, there's likely one per family, but everybody's invited to bring their prayer if you want to do that. What we want to do now is just give a few moments of space before we come up, and then the band will start to play another song. And as that song, at any point during that song, if you want to come up here, there's a little box right here. If you want to, you can linger by the cross. You can go back to your seats. There's going to be prayer ministry later on too. And we just want to take this moment to do business with God. I know some of the things that we talked about today, some of the things we've been talking about in the series are challenging topics, like heavier type topics. And I get that, and I feel that myself. But the Lord wants to meet with you. The Lord wants to have an encounter with you by his Holy Spirit. And maybe some of that will happen right now. So I invite you just to pour your heart out before God and take this opportunity to do that. And then we'll share on next steps after this.